So this is the topic here. I'll just be very quick in giving you some of the results that we've generated for the first half of the 20th century. And even though it's a historical time period from our perspective, the problem itself remains. It remains contemporary and it remains an issue. And if anything, it's become even more of an issue now that the two other main vectors of lead poisoning, lead from the atmosphere being transmitted from gasoline and lead in lead-based paints, have largely been eradicated. The only remaining population level source of lead contamination is lead in drinking water, and it's still a problem as it was in 1920, as it was in 1950, and as it will likely remain until lead service lines are removed from the piping in America's cities. Chicago is a great example of a city where this is a problem that's absolutely endemic and affects every neighborhood in the city. Chicago actually didn't just allow lead service lines to be used to move water from the mains in the street into dwellings. That's the service line. It didn't just allow it to be lead, it actually mandated that those lines be lead until 1986. And as in everything Chicago, it was the result of a political deal, in this case between the Democratic Party and the Plumbers Union. Plumbers love to work with lead because it's so pliable. So Chicago's got a problem that's far worse than most other cities, but it's the city we happen to also live in. So it's useful to know that this is something we should be concerned about here in Chicago itself. What are the consequences of lead exposure? In this case, lead that's born in water that's coming through lead service lines that are leaching lead into the water that's being consumed. The simple chemistry of it is just that lead mimics calcium in the brain. They have the same valence structure, so the brain thinks that lead is calcium. It lodges in synapses where the calcium is needed instead as a neurotransmitter. It results in, among other things, lower IQ scores, diminished prefrontal cortex functioning and impulse control, kidney failure, cardiovascular disease, a whole bunch of other things that I didn't have room for at the bottom of the slide here. Basically, lead is bad for you. So just the simple medical textbook diagram of what's going on. The lead would be in those synapses and it's substituting for calcium. Those synapses are then essentially dead as connections between the respective nerves that end in them. And as a result, no information gets transmitted through them. The only way to eradicate the problem, you can't get the lead out of the synapses once it's in there. Instead, the only way to eradicate the problem or to alleviate the effects is to generate a bunch of new neuronal connections. And that only happens through intellectual stimulation. We'll get to that later on in the presentation. Our research question is a relatively simple one. Does early lead exposure at roughly age 1 predict cognitive functioning, educational attainment, and income in later life between the ages of, say, 25 and 65? And can these effects be remediated? The innovations that we think that we've introduced to this literature are an extremely long follow-up period between lead exposure and outcomes, basically an entire lifetime over which we can observe individuals at the population level. We're not talking about small cohort studies that were created either prospectively or retrospectively. We're talking about doing this for entire populations. We have several validated cognitive and psychological measures as outcomes that I'll briefly talk about. Again, a large sample from a broad population. We're examining subclinical levels of lead exposure. So not just the kinds of cases that show up in the newspaper when there's been some major incident like the problems that arose in Flint, Michigan. Instead, these are people who are consuming levels of lead that are what you'd get on an everyday basis in American cities throughout the entirety of the 20th century. And we have what we think is a fairly novel strategy for identifying lead's causal impact. The basic model that we're talking about here is one in which we rely on a simple relationship between the pH of the water traveling through lead service lines and how much lead leaches from the interior wall of that pipe into the water that's traveling through it. Chemistry, and water chemistry in particular, has shown us in all sorts of simple bench science experiments that the pH of the water is neutral at the minimum amount of plumosolvency. So around a pH of 7, you minimize the amount of lead that leaches into the water. Any departure from neutral pH to either side is going to increase the amount of lead that leaches into the water. So what we expect when we look at some cognitively sensitive outcome later in life, if we look at the relationship between that outcome and the pH of the water through which the water traveling through lead service lines, that cognitively sensitive outcome will display the mirror image of the relationship between pH and plumosolvency. Why this is a novel identification strategy is the kinds of outcomes that we're looking at, things like IQ and income and educational attainment. There's no reason why any of those should be sensitive to the pH of the water that people are consuming if it's not being mediated by this chemical relationship that we know is generated by pH in lead service pipes. If we look at the same cognitive outcome, the same relationship between pH and, say, income in places that don't have lead service pipes, we'd expect there to be absolutely no relationship, and that's exactly what we find, that there's no relationship between pH and income, except in cities that have lead service lines. And we can show you that in some detail. Here's one example. This is just showing what the plumosolvency relationship looks like, the relationship between the pH that gets into the lead that gets into the water and the pH of the water supply. A bunch of different studies have replicated exactly the same result. It's also the case that there are other dimensions of water chemistry that matter. It's not just the pH. It could be the amount of calcium carbonate that's in the water. Calcium carbonate will form a thin film on the inside of pipes through which it passes that can actually be protective by preventing lead from leaching. So one of the things we want to control for is not just the pH of the water, but also calcium carbonate. And we have the ability to do exactly that with the kind of data that we have. So how can we assess this relationship between cognitively sensitive outcomes and what we presume is plumosolvency and the amount of lead that's in people's drinking water? Through pH. We link males, and we're only doing males in this particular study because they're easier to link across censuses because their names don't change. So we link males from their 1900 through 1940 locations where we know the piping material and the pH of the water supply, to World War II enlistment records, which contain a test for IQ, which the US Army used to assign individuals to specific branches of the service. The 1940 census of population, which includes income and educational attainment. The 2000 census, which includes income and educational attainment. And also the health and retirement study, which has information on longevity and later life cognition. This work was actually pioneered by my late colleague, Werner Truskin. And if you want to get even more frightened by the possibility of lead in your drinking water, take a look at Werner's book from MIT Press from a couple of years ago. Where do we get the information on piping material? How do we know that a city has lead service lines? Well, it comes from what's likely the dullest book that you will ever read, the Manual of American Water Works, which for every water system in the country between 1881 and 1897 tells you exactly the two things that we need to know. It tells you the piping material, and it tells you the source of the water that system used. And we can then use additional information that comes from publications from the US Geological Survey to look at the chemistry of that source water. So that gives us the two key pieces of information that we need, whether the piping material is lead or some other material, and what the pH of the source water is that's being sent through those pipes. At this time, for the first half of the 20th century, water systems are not treating their water to minimize plumosolvency. They're not taking advantage of the fact that by manipulating the pH, you can diminish the risk substantially of water having lead leach into it. So we actually have a fairly pure experiment here in the sense that that pH relationship with the outcomes is unmediated by anything that's being done by local water systems. There's a bunch of other sources that we can bring to bear on getting this information about the lead water supply. These are the cities for which we have information on lead piping. And you can see the large circles are cities that had lead piping with acidic or alkaline water supplies either side of the neutral pH. And the smaller red circles are the places that had lead piping with basically neutral pH, so the places where we think the danger is minimized. Then we also know all the other cities with non-lead pipe and any kind of water supply. First effect that we can see is by looking at the IQ results from World War II. We discovered the fact that the Army had kept these records completely serendipitously. They retained records at the individual level for about 500,000 of the 9 million enlistees in the Second World War, with enough identifying information that we can find these people, locate them in the place where they were living as children, and thereby implement this simple identification strategy of looking at the relationship between their measured IQ and the pH of the water supply for places that did and didn't have lead service lines. And this is basically what the relationship looks like. The AGCT, Army General Classification Test, is that IQ test. And if you run this relationship with just a quadratic in pH, you can see that there's a dramatic effect, and you're best off in places with a pH right around 7. How big a difference is this? In a quantitative sense, how much difference are we talking about here? In going from a pH of something like 6 to a pH of just above 7, there at the peak, you're basically gaining about 5 IQ points. And that's a significant difference in studies of IQ. That's roughly the modern East Asian versus white gap in global IQ studies. So that's a significant amount. And you can see the same thing in tabular form with all the asterisks to indicate the statistical significance. It's a whole lot easier to see when I show it graphically. We can subdivide the population into those in places with lead service lines and non-lead. And among those in lead places, the ones who are non-movers, that is, who are in the same location when they enlist in the war as they are when they're children. So these are people that presumably have had an even larger dose of lead. And you can find that those people do, in fact, have a significantly more diminished cognitive capacity than people who either lived in places that didn't have any lead service lines at all, or who started out in a lead service line place and moved to a place that did not have lead service lines later. This is educational attainment, and it shows roughly the same thing. The 1940 census was the first time the Census Bureau asked, how many completed years of schooling do you have? And here you can see the other useful piece of information that comes from the 1940 census, which is income. It's the first time the census asks about income at the individual level. And what you can see here is the black line is for individuals in places that did not have lead pipes, and the slope of that line is statistically indistinguishable from 0. And the distinction between the dashed and the solid lines are movers versus non-movers. The red line is for individuals in places with lead service lines, and that relationship is statistically significantly different from 0 in the quadratic, and you can see roughly what the magnitudes are. The other 2 lines are looking at lead cities, non-movers with controls, and non-movers without the controls. You can see the differences there are quite striking between the red line and the black line, and this is income in 1940, and it's just pH on the bottom. And there's no, again, other obvious reason that we know of why the pH of the water you're ingesting as a child should affect your adult income other than through this mechanism that we're proposing. The pH in a place like Memphis, Tennessee is around 6.4 at this time. In Albany, New York, it's around 7.3. So we're talking about a difference of about $175 per year, which is about 10% of 1940 income, just as a difference between someone who was drinking the water as a child in Memphis versus someone who's drinking the water as a child in Albany, New York. Here's the relationship with just 1900 location and 1940 education. And again, you see the same thing, flat relationship between pH and the outcome for places without lead service lines, quadratic, clearly in the sense of having that characteristic curvature for places that had lead service lines, worse effects for non-movers. What do we know about other cognitively sensitive outcomes that we can turn our same diagnostic tools to look at? And here, I'll suggest a particular cognitively sensitive outcome, which is the direction in which our work is moving right now. That is Alzheimer's disease. So it was suggested in an article in Epidemiology in 1998 by a psychiatric epidemiologist named Martin Prince that maybe there is some sort of relationship between early life lead exposure and a predisposition toward late onset Alzheimer's and late onset Alzheimer's, but the same logic applies to some other forms of dementia, but he spoke specifically about LOAD. At the time I was working on this and looking for the next outcome that we wanted to examine, I was in Paris doing some work with some colleagues there, and I knew Martin was up in London. I just emailed him out of the blue and said, I have this idea, can I come and talk to you? And I hopped on the train the next day and went up to visit him at King's College. And he said that, yeah, no one had ever really followed up on this idea. And for a very simple reason. There's no data that actually follows individuals from their early life lead exposure to the ability to diagnose some late life cognitive outcome like Alzheimer's. So there's no way you're ever going to actually be able to demonstrate this. But it seemed like a good idea just based on the structures in the brain that are implicated in both late onset Alzheimer's and early life lead exposure. I said, I probably didn't actually say this, but I would have if I had been clever enough. I would have said, Martin, hold my beer. I will show you exactly how we can do this, and demonstrated to him how the kind of data that we have for the early part of the 19th century makes it possible to do exactly that. Since that time, there have been a number of studies that have followed up on Martin's original conjecture and that have begun to look at this relationship between lead exposure and Alzheimer's, and have done so largely with animal models, but it's increasingly become possible, as our work demonstrates, to do it with human populations as well. So here's just a couple of the citations. This, which you can see my name on, was in Science Advances this past year, where we took individuals who are in the current health and retirement study, which has a screener for cognitive decline that was developed by Ken Lange and other people who work on the HRS at the University of Michigan. We took the HRS, we linked them back to their childhood location, and we looked at individuals from age 60 onward to see what, if any, effect there was of the pH of the water that they were consuming in places that did and didn't have lead service pipes. So basically, we took the same kind of data that we talked about on the piping and the source water chemistry and the health and retirement study data on cognitive function at older ages. And what you can see here is that for this population, the red line is the population of people who have lead pipes and are in places where their source water as children was not neutral, so either side of the minimum for plumosolvency. Up here are people who are either in places without lead pipes or with better water in terms of the pH and its relationship to plumosolvency. What we expected to see was that there would be faster cognitive decline in the population at risk from the combination of bad pH and lead service lines. What we instead found is that already by age 60, there's a significant deficit in the population of people in that particularly at-risk group, but the trajectory over time is largely consistent with what happens to everybody else, such that by the end, by age 90 or even by age 80, you've actually gotten a little bit closer to the rest of the population for the ones who are most at risk. Now, we suspect that this is an issue of statistical power because the number of people that we're dealing with is on the order of just about 3,000 or 4,000 that we have linked back to their childhood data. What we'll have when we do the next batch of this work that I'll show you a little bit about in just a second is population level data with several million observations, where the ability to trace out the kinds of differences in trajectory slopes that we expected to anticipate, that we expected to find here, will be much easier to discern. So we'll get to that in just a second. Let me just give you a couple of conclusions regarding what we've done previously. Oops, let me go back. Just getting way ahead of myself here. Okay, so the conclusions regarding lead's effects that we can discern from our data from the early part of the 20th century is that lead's effects are straightforward to detect in terms of intelligence, educational attainment, and income. There may be links to later life health and cognitive decline as well. Can the effects be remediated? This is the point to which Lori alluded in the introduction. And the answer is basically yes. That's what has been done as treatment for the children who were exposed to lead in Michigan. Again, you can't flush the lead out of someone's brain. What you can do is cause the brain to rewire itself around those dead synapses. And what we find is we can demonstrate there's some evidence for that in our population level data. So here's one example of an animal study that suggests that an enriched environment is protective against lead-induced neurotoxicity. This is in a rat population, and it's looking at those who are exposed to lead and who are given an enriched environment. I don't know what an enriched environment for rats consists of. I imagine little magazines and important stuff that they'd like to read, but it's mostly going to be toys and wheels and the kinds of things that you usually imagine hamsters and rats using. The figure looks at two groups: those that are in an enriched environment with an E, who were dosed with nothing but pure H2O, those who are isolated from their peers and receive less stimulation as a result and are dosed with water, those who are enriched and dosed with lead, and those who are isolated and dosed with lead. And this is escape time from a maze. So just a basic measure of cognitive capacity among rats. And clearly the group with the highest escape time, with the lowest cognitive capacity, is those who were dosed with lead and subsequently put in an isolated, non-intellectually stimulating environment. So the animal science suggests, yeah, there may be something to this sort of thing. What I can show you here are some preliminary results that bring in information from a completely different study. During World War II, when enlistment among males was at its peak in roughly the late part of 1943, the US government began to fund an entire network of preschools for children between the ages of 2 and 5 to encourage women to enter the labor force. The idea is you would drop your kid off at the preschool, go and work an 8-hour shift, pick the kids up, and your life goes on for the rest of the day. This was vital to the war effort, as it turns out, and extremely successful at getting women into the labor force. We have a lot of information on the thousands of locations where these preschools were set up. We don't know for most cities exactly which individuals attended those schools, but we know for our individuals that we have water, chemistry, and piping data for, whether they were also in a place that received one of these preschools. So that's a possible avenue of early life intellectual stimulation for those children. What I'm showing here is the year 2000 wage and salary income for individuals, and I'm looking only here at people who grew up with lead piping service lines. Only for people with the lead. There's no relationship for either of these two groups without the lead. The yellow line is those who were located in places as children that received one of these preschools. And you can see that for that population, there is, once again, no relationship between the pH of the source water and the level of income in the year 2000 when these individuals are adults. You only see that relationship, that parabolic relationship between pH and in the year 2000 income for those individuals who were living in places that did not receive one of these Lanham preschools. They're called Lanham preschools because they were put into place under something called the Lanham National Defense Act of 1941. So the idea here is that for this one simple, roughly a very coarse measure of potential intellectual stimulation for those children, it does seem to make a difference as far as what their adult income actually looks like. Moving forward, and this is the next part of the research agenda here, what we're planning on doing is generating population-level lead exposure to, again, waterborne lead for individuals when they were under age 5. And we're going to focus here on cohorts that were born right around 1952. Why 1952? Well, if you remember back when I showed you some of the source materials for determining the water chemistry of the source water, there was a large series of studies that were done for more than 1,300 cities and towns by the U.S. Geological Survey, in which they collected detailed information on the source of every water system's water and on the chemical composition of that water. So for this population of people born right around 1952, we know exactly what the quality of the water was that they were drinking in terms of pH and the whole set of other chemical dimensions of that water supply. We can then use the fact that we know at the city level which cities were using lead service lines as late as 1950. And also by the end of the coming the end of this coming year, we will have information from every water system in the country, which has had to generate a complete inventory of every lead service line still in existence. The EPA, under the original lead and copper rule, required that cities begin to get a handle on this, but they've now required complete inventories be submitted as of October. We'll have access to that data, and therefore the ability for households that we identify as being in place around 1952 to identify whether those places had lead service lines or not. There's another source of identification that we can use in addition to just the actual information for lead service lines. That is, in cities that we know used predominantly lead service lines, they didn't use them for every dwelling. You wouldn't use a lead service line in a dwelling of 4 or more units. In a one single family home, a 2-flat, a 3-flat, yes, you would, but in anything larger than that, the water pressure necessary to get water to the upper floors of that building would have been too great for a plumber to have actually used lead piping. It's simply not economical at that dimension. And as a consequence, when you look even in historical data that we have where we know the actual material house by house, it's extremely unlikely that multi-family dwellings, once you get above 3 units, actually had lead piping, even in cities where lead was the predominant service pipe material. So we can compare individuals who grew up next door to each other, one in a 2-flat, one in a 4 or 5-flat. And even in cities that predominantly use lead service lines, we can have much greater confidence that the 2-flat had lead than did the 4-flat. And as a result, be able to get the ability to focus on individuals for which any other external circumstances are likely to have been virtually identical, because we can focus on just those kinds of things that may have differed between 2 households that were physically located right next door to each other in the same neighborhood. We're going to follow individuals from their 1950 location into the 1990 and 2000 U.S. Census of population, which is going to give us information on education, income, disability as adults of just the sort that we've used for the previous study that goes up through the 1940 census. The 1950 census of population is now publicly available. That means that you can actually look up individuals and get their exact name and street address, and with almost trivial ease, link them backwards to any location where they can be identified in a previous census or in birth records. And within the Census Bureau's Research Data Center infrastructure, you can actually link them to a variety of other sources. In particular, for this population, we can link them to U.S. income tax records from Form 1040. The Census Bureau has these records for every American from 1964 to 1994 for roughly every 5th year. And it's a darn good thing that the Census Bureau is like my parents and never throws anything out, because the IRS threw these records out 20 years ago. They don't hold on to records as long as the Census Bureau does. And these records were given by the IRS to the Census Bureau to aid the Census Bureau in validating the incomes that were being reported by people in things like the census and the current population survey. So the Census Bureau still has them, they're accessible, and within a few weeks, like a few weeks from today, they will be linked to the 1950 census. And that'll allow us to take tens of millions of people born right around 1950, look at their susceptibility to lead exposure because of the piping material and the pH, and then subsequently look at their adult incomes from 1964 right down through 1994. Beginning in the year 2000, you can pick up those same individuals in other population-wide sources. The 2000 Census of Population and the American Community Survey that's run every year from 2001 forward have the same kind of information on income, educational attainment, and disability. So this just fills in an important part of the gap between the 2000 census and earlier outcomes. We can link these individuals to Medicare. Medicare has something called the Chronic Conditions Warehouse, which allows you to identify individuals based on the set of claims that they have made once they've entered the system. And that claims data is analyzed by ICD codes to try and make sense of what conditions may be underlying the set of claims that are being made by those individuals, because you need to add a diagnostic code to every Medicare claim. This will allow us to identify the onset of ADRD and a whole bunch of other plausible sequelae of lead exposure. Finally, we can link all of our people to the National Death Index, which basically records cause of death and exact date and place of death for everyone who died in the United States between 1979 and the present. It's based on the collation that the National Center for Health Statistics does every year of the entire universe of death certificates that are provided by all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. We'll use the resulting longitudinal data, basically following tens of millions of people from cradle to grave, to project the added, I think I ran out of power before I finished making the slide, to project the added burden that will be imposed on the nation's healthcare system as the population of people who continue to be exposed to waterborne lead in the second half of the 20th century age into retirement, and to give a sense of how much additional burden we'll experience, in particular in terms of ADRD and the other causes, the other problems that are subsequently related to waterborne lead exposure. I think that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Yeah, we're right at a good time here, and so I would like to open it up for questions. And are you fielding the ones from online? Okay, all right. Let me go hand over here. Go ahead.
As a technical question, the accountant in me is concerned that the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, is giving income tax information to the Census Bureau. Is that linked by name?
Yes, yes, it is. But when I'm in the Census Bureau's research data center, all of that data has been anonymized, so I don't see names.
Okay.
I see a Census Bureau generated ID number that is imposed on both the census records that I'm looking at as well as the IRS records. So I can't look at people's names. I have to do this on site in a protected research data enclave. There's one here in Chicago located at the Fed over on LaSalle Street. So I actually have to go into that facility, and I have gone through a very arduous process of vetting by the Census Bureau and the FBI to make sure that I'm sufficiently reliable that I will not be revealing anything identifiable from any of the information that comes out of my work. I actually had to have a 2-hour sit-down interview with the FBI at one point about exactly how much I knew about everything, including what the penalties were for violating any of the privacy restrictions that the Census Bureau imposes. And I go through a new training on that every single year. So they're quite cautious about making sure that privacy is protected through the process of anonymizing all the data.
Thanks. So I'm a general internist and health services researcher here, and worked with a fellow, incidentally, who we did some work using the National Ambulatory Medical Care Survey. The fellow went into the enclave, and you'll be happy to know they did eventually come out of the enclave, released. So
Yes.
you'll make it out. But I actually wanted to explore, and I think your latter analysis, this forthcoming analysis, will address my questions more precisely. But if you go back to the graph showing the relationship between lead exposure, pH, and any of the outcomes, I just wanted to explore the possibility of unmeasured confounding.
Yep.
So why would a city not put in lead pipes? So I have two questions. Like, why would a city not put in lead pipes?
Right. There's a couple of reasons. One is it depends on the cost of the lead pipe relative to where it's being installed. So lead is very difficult to transport because it's very heavy. So if you're closer to a place where lead pipes are produced, and they're only produced in a discrete set of about 7 foundries all across the country, if you're too far away from the nearest foundry, it's going to be cheaper for you to use steel or iron pipe. And that's the only thing that distinguishes those kinds of places. There's no other really good reason that's given for why cities use one material rather than another.
And then, and related, so why would a city not, I mean, you learn in basic chemistry, water should have a pH of about 7. Like, why would you be living somewhere where the pH was alkaline or acidic? Why would cities permit their water to be that way?
Because they had no sense that this was causing the kinds of lead leaching that we now know that it did in the places that had lead service lines. And there's a lot of discussion at the time about what, if any, difference it makes for local water systems to have a pH of even 5.5 versus a pH of 9.5. And nobody seems to care. It's seemingly just a matter of aesthetics. Some people think that water of a certain pH tastes better than water of a different pH, but there's no expectation that it's going to produce any deleterious effects at this time.
Right. So then the ecologic argument I'm driving at through all this, it doesn't make quite, just to say it explicitly, like implicitly, it should be pretty obvious that, people who live in a place where they happen to not use lead lines, that seems less likely to be related to something else. But if you're living in a place where they weren't concerned enough to care about the pH, maybe there's something else about living in that environment that's actually explaining this, and it's not the lead. Yeah.
No, the thing is, at this time, nobody is concerned. So that seems like an ecological confounder, but it's uniform across the entire population. Okay. In fact, throughout this time, even the AMA, there's a little section at the back of JAMA that you can see, even in the 1940s and 1950s, people would write in and say, should I be worried about the lead in the service lines that are coming in from my house? And the expert that JAMA would get to write back the reply would say, no, if there's any lead that's getting into your water in such small amounts, it's not going to have any effect at all. And yes, yes.
Yeah, great work. I just share some of the concerns from the last question, because given it's an ecological study, the results are remarkable. They're really just like, wow. So I'm just wondering if there isn't any obvious confounding that we're missing out, and if something else that hasn't been discussed has come up with the peer review. If anything, if you could share that with us, that'd be great. If there's any concerns. The other question I had was there efforts to, you've obviously got a great resource here. I'm just wondering if you had efforts to replicate this in another area, because I know I work a lot with the UK Biobank, which has 500,000 people, and they have all the geocoding of where they're born. But I'm not sure if they'd have. Well, you could probably find out from the UK if they have this lead information that you have. But any efforts to see if you can replicate this finding in a different country?
Yeah, so the two obvious candidates for us to do this are going to be the UK and France. And the UK is particularly good because parts of it were so severely bombed during the Second World War that you can find neighborhoods where one building was destroyed and is still in, is no longer in place. It's been replaced with something brand new as of the 1950s, right next to a building that dates back to the 16th century and has plumbing that dates back to the early part of the 18th century. So within a city like London, it's possible to easily identify places that would have been rebuilt in ways that would not have likely contained lead service lines versus places that still did, and to look at those kinds of outcomes. This problem, the prevalence of lead service lines, is just as bad in the entirety of the EU as it is in the United States today. So there's a lot of scope for doing this in other places. As far as your initial question about how good the results are, we haven't found someone who has offered a criticism that diminishes the magnitude of the effects. The only criticism that we get is that the results are too large. They're implausibly large. And they're only implausibly large if you can think of a reason why they're that large. Otherwise, they are what they are. So it's been a challenge, but not because specific criticisms arise, but just because people suspect there's got to be something wrong with this analysis because the effects are so big. And we can't find one. And we think that this relationship between pH and the cognitively sensitive outcomes is one that will convince most of the referees that we're going to confront with this kind of work. Yes. Yep, we have a whole set of household level covariates, including parental income, parental literacy, neighborhood effects. We know exactly what your neighbors look like, occupation, age of the structure, whether your parents own or rent the house that you're living in, a whole bunch of things that you'd actually want to control for, and none of them make a single bit of difference for the results.
There are 500,000
Yep. Yep.
What about like model? It's quite radical.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. We've experimented with a bunch of different semi and non-parametric ways of modeling that relationship, and it doesn't change a thing. I should say that the results from the AGCT, from that Army IQ test, we discovered the data completely by accident. The Army created punch cards, old Hollerith punch cards, when people enlisted, and they included, among the other characteristics of enlistees, their height and their weight, as well as occupation and marital status and a bunch of other things. As I was going through the data for the entire 9 million records that had then been computerized, I noticed that if you look at the weight field, for specific times and specific enlistment sites, the weight average drops from about 148 pounds to 100 pounds. And the standard deviation drops from 25 pounds to 20 pounds. And that suggested that there was something strange about the data for those enlistment sites at that time. And we dug a little bit further and found a memo to the Hollerith punch card operators in the field, instructing them for a period of 3 months in the spring of 1943 to record the results of the AGCT in the field for weight on the punch cards, rather than to put in the weight. They discontinued this after about 3 months, so from March to June of 1943. But during that time, we've got records for about 500,000 people. And it's the largest US population for which we have any kind of thing approaching an IQ test. Anything else is much smaller scale, usually on a much more focused population. But we found it just completely by accident, and it seems to do exactly what we expect it to do based on what we know about the lead that people are consuming.
I got a question for you. When you first begin your presentation, you mentioned that Chicago is lagging behind the national average for replacing this lead pipe. It's just because of finance budget issues.
Yep.
You mentioned that 27,000 for change one, and Chicago has 400,000. Just no money.
There's also a huge coordination problem, because to the extent that one of the things that's protective is over time calcium carbonate building up a film on the inside of the pipes. If I replace my lead service line in my dwelling, that disturbs the film on the inside of my neighbor's lead service lines. Simply the banging on the pipes in the process of replacing my line is going to allow my neighbor's film to deteriorate. So suddenly they're getting a huge spike in the lead coming into their drinking water, as does anybody else in the neighborhood whose piping is affected by the vibrations coming through mine. So you want to do this block by block rather than to do it individual household by individual household. And that's a big problem because you need to coordinate among a bunch of different individuals. And the city is not paying for this. The city is telling citizens that even though we mandated this through 1986, it's your responsibility to replace the line and to pay for that. All we will do is help coordinate it if you want to get a bunch of your neighbors to do it at the same time. I walk through my neighborhood. I live around Addison and Damon. And there's a lot of buildings there that date back to when the neighborhood was originally platted around 1910. It was an old apple orchard. Every day that I walk the dog, there's a new house, almost always a single family home, that's being renovated and where there's a team of people with a backhoe and a bunch of shovels out in front of that building. And I stop and I ask them what they're doing, and they're replacing a lead service line because it still exists in those buildings. I usually have a piece of show and tell that I bring, which is a piece of the lead service line that I got from one of these work sites, but I forgot to grab it before I came out of the house this morning. But you can see on the piping exactly what that coating of calcium carbonate on the inside actually looks like. But it's just a real expensive process, and one that Chicago has been way too late to get into the game in a serious way on. Other cities like Pittsburgh that had huge numbers of lead service lines, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Cleveland, mainly older industrial cities in the Northeast, have replaced almost all of their lead service lines just over the last 10 or 15 years. Now, admittedly, they're all smaller than Chicago, but Chicago has really done nothing. At one point, I was trying to get what are called tap cards, which are the records of when every individual dwelling in the city was tapped into the water main in the street. The plumber who did the tap work had to fill out a little index card with information on the piping material, the diameter of the pipe, and the exact street address, and whether any changes were made to the piping subsequently. I tried to get these tap cards from the city of Chicago's water system, and they won't give them out. And they've come up with a variety of increasingly suspect explanations for why they're unwilling to yield these records. The main concern is apparently that the more people who know about this, the worse it looks for the city, and the worse it becomes for the city legally if a large number of people decide that they want to shift the cost from the individual household owner to the city to remediate the problem. So I tried to use the Freedom of Information Act, a whole bunch of other levers to try and pry these cards loose from the city, and I just could not get a hold of them. But now, as of October, they will have had to use exactly those same records to generate the inventory of lead service lines that they will have to provide and make publicly available through the EPA. So
a follow-up question is, if I'm looking for buy or rent a new home or apartment, how do I figure out this building has a
whether you have in your own dwelling a lead service line? So there's a very simple way to look, which is to go down to where your water meter is, if your house has metered water, or to where the water shutoff is, the point at which you can turn off the water as it enters your dwelling. On the incoming side of the shutoff, if that pipe is lead, you can scratch it with a key or a screwdriver, and it will clearly scratch and make an indentation into the material because lead is very soft as metals go. If it's steel, if it's copper, if it's iron, none of those things are really going to be scarred in this way by that simple test. That's the absolute easiest way of doing it. Otherwise, it's a challenge because the city won't tell you.
Thanks. We are running out of time here. There's another class coming in, but I just wanted to close up by saying that this is really also very consistent with the human ecology literature on child development. And so all mothers, all families, parents should be very happy. They put their children into daycare. They're better off there than at home with the mother.
Yep.
Anyways, and mothers are better off at work too. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.